And thank you for coming to our second panel. Really excited to have everyone here on a Sunday afternoon and evening from all over the globe, literally. So my name is Laurie Lopez-Charles, and I am the co-lead with my colleague, Dr. Gameela Samarasinghe, for Global Family Systems and Psychosocial Resilience. This is a Citizen Diplomacy Action Fund rapid response grant to support community resilience and engagement in direct response to the coronavirus. So this project is funded by the U.S. Department of State and implemented by Partners of the Americas in partnership with the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs. The goal of our project is we will have a series of 15 panels throughout next spring. And our goal is to work with systemic, family-focused mental health and psychosocial support communities to develop and distribute open access guest expert panels that focus on global family systems approaches and psychosocial resilience during the COVID-19. So it's my pleasure to welcome all of you here and to introduce one of our panelists. I will introduce Simone and then hand it over to Gameela to introduce Saliha, and then we'll hand you the floor. Simone G Young is from Trinidad and Tobago. She's been a career diplomat since 1999. She served at her country's permanent mission to the UN office in Geneva and as the Deputy Consul General in Toronto from June 2005 to February 2008. At the permanent mission, her assignments included being the mission's desk officer assigned to key UN specialized agencies, including the ILO, the World Health Organization, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Pardon me. A fellow of Georgetown University's Edmund Walsh School of the Foreign Service Foreign Policy Leadership course and an alumnus of the Aspen Institute, Ms. Young was the 2016-2017 Fulbright Hubert Humphrey Fellow for Trinidad and Tobago. And she focused on gender and foreign policy and international affairs during her tenure as a fellow at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. In that time, she was also a visiting fellow in foreign policy at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. Simone is an international affairs graduate of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. She also holds a Master of Science degree in Marine Resource and Environmental Management and a Bachelor of Science degree in Sociology and Government from the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill, and St. Augustine campuses, respectively. Thank you and welcome, Simone. Hand it over to Gameela. Yeah, wow, you sound amazing.
Thank you, Laurie. You make me sound really good on paper. That sounds fantastic. Thank you so much.
Gameela, I'll mute myself and hand it over to you.
Okay, well. Can you hear me now? Hello?
Yes.
Yeah. So it is my great pleasure to introduce the other speaker, who is Dr. Saliha Bava. She's a couples and family therapist. She's also an associate professor of marriage and family therapy at Mercy College in New York. For more than 20 years, she has consulted and implemented performative, play-based, and collaborative dialogic change processes within organizational, community, family, learning, and research systems. She is an advisory board member and associate at the Taos Institute. She is a co-founding board member of the International Certificate Program in Collaborative Dialogic Practices and has served on the American Family Therapy Academy Board. She's also the director of research at the International Trauma Studies Program. Currently, She is co-founding the Resilience Collective in response to the COVID-19. This draws on her inclusion work in organizations and MHPSS experiences. She has also worked in the developmental sector, community engagement, and disaster response in India and the US, specifically in Houston to Hurricane Katrina and Ike, for which, incidentally, she received a leadership award from the city of Houston. Current research is focused on inclusion and cultivating relational practices for engaging emergence through play improvisation. Dr. Bava is the co-author of the Relational Book for Parenting and numerous chapters and articles. She also maintains a small consulting practice in New York City. You can follow her on Twitter at ThinkPlay. So I welcome Saliha. Very happy that she is joining us today. And I hand over the mic to Laurie.
Thank you, Gameela.
And I will hand it over to, yes, Saliha and Simone. I think you guys figured out who's going to speak first. So feel free to take it away. Thank you both.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Simone, you want to kick us off?
Sure, why not?
Right.
Thanks, Saliha. Great chatting with you yesterday.
Yes, wonderful energy too. So I hope to bring that in here with you.
I hope so, yes. So if we were to take off looking at our panel objectives, I mean, I think Laurie and Gameela, you've given us a lot of stuff to work with here. Very rich, I think a very rich platform from which to take off our discussion today. So thanks for that. As you can tell from my background, I'm not a therapist per se, at all, as a matter of fact. I'm on the other side of the river, as it were, having worked in foreign policy for pretty much more than half my life. So here we go. I think one of the things that connect foreign policy and diplomacy to what therapists and family therapists do your field is the question of human security, yes? And more specifically, the issue of how do we ensure all persons enjoy a particular, their human security is, for lack of a better term, secured, not to be repetitive, in their particular circumstances. And so I think one of the things that has always interested me, particularly having worked in Geneva, was the question of what particular vulnerabilities attend someone's life, whether it's in education, whether it's in labor, whether it's health or gender equity, that really impact on their enjoyment of their human rights and their human security as a result. So I think we certainly find common ground there, yes? I see Saliha shaking, so that's shaking
Yes.
head. That's great. Yes.
Yes, absolutely.
Great. I think when we talk about human rights, certainly international law on human rights, international human rights law, rather, the main organ that really stands in the vanguard, or is supposed to stand in the vanguard of protecting, promoting, and fulfilling human rights is the state, correct? The nation state. And if we were to look at one of the panel's objectives, we were looking at the basis of state sovereignty and the role of international human rights law in regard to family psychosocial health, including the concept of human security. And so when we talk about we talk about state sovereignty, it takes us back to 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia. So I'm not going to take us all into European history because that's, I mean, a long discussion, as you probably guess. But in the mid-17th century, you had a seminal peace treaty in Westphalia in Germany that ushered in an era of the nation state, which essentially said that every state has sovereignty over its particular territory. Hitherto, that time, what you would have had was a Christian commonwealth where the Pope would have had spiritual dominion over a particular range of countries geographically. And temporarily, you would have had an emperor represented by the Catholic Emperor and the Habsburg Empire, as you would have probably familiar with, yes? But after the 30 Years' War, this has been going on for like 30 years, a huge war in Europe. You would have had the Peace of Westphalia. In modern times, it's known as the Treaty of Westphalia, where countries will have treaties would have been signed stating that in some nation states were created where different princes would have had sovereignty over dominion over different areas of territory. And so what you would have had was essentially the rise of the nation state. So that takes care of the question of state sovereignty and how it would have generally arisen. It's a longer story than that, but quite boring in some respects, I suspect. I don't think there's need for us to get into that at this point, quite frankly. But with the rise of the nation state, it raises the other question of course, how states interact with each other. And of course, we'd have had a series of wars throughout human history, ending, of course, most recently with the great wars of the past 20th century, yes? Arising out of those wars would have been the need for the greater protection and promotion of human rights. And so in 1948, we would have seen, as we're all familiar with, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which really is the foundation for human rights law as we know it today. Please feel free to stop me at any time, or if you wish me to go slower with these questions, these issues, or what have you. So in 1948, we have a new era where we have in human rights law, which is like the beginning of it, the modern era, I would say, with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights being signed and adopted. Subsequent to which you would have seen in 1966 the conclusion of two other pillars of international human rights law, which are both called, first, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Essentially, what those focus on are, as you can probably tell, civil and political rights focus on issues with respect to your right to enjoy self-determination, freedom of expression, freedom of association, and what have you. Particularly, and very importantly, the ICCPR, which is civil and political rights, speaks to the right to life and those issues, very fundamental issues, as well as the right to choose your political association and what have you. Economic and social rights, which is the other treaty, and I should say at this point, taken together, they form the trifecta of what is called the International Bill of Human Rights, right? So you have the Universal Declaration, then the two covenants on civil and political rights, and then on economic, social, and cultural rights. Everyone's with me, yes? Thank God I see Saliha. Excellent.
Yeah. Yes, we're with you.
Great, yeah. So a lot of my work in Geneva, I was the desk officer assigned to the Human Rights Council, and that allowed one a front seat role really to how these treaties are enforced and how they're upheld, how they're promoted, and what have you. And it really drove home how important they are to our everyday lives and the things we take for granted, right? The right to vote, exercise your franchise. For example, social and political rights also include issues that in some countries we take, as I said, we take for granted very freely and openly every day. The right to join a trade union, the right to associate, the freedom of association, and such issues. Economic and social rights also include, importantly, the right to work and to choose your line of work and so forth. These are things that we have come to, I think, in modern society, assume that they're given, but in many countries, they're still not promoted, protected, and fulfilled in the way we would have, the original framers of these declarations would have envisioned them being, yes? That being said, subsequent to those protocols those covenants being concluded, you then have other human rights treaties, international human rights treaties, such as the Treaty on the Rights of the Child, Persons with Disabilities, the Rights of Women, Discrimination Against Women, and of course, treaties that deal with migrants and the rights of migrants and refugees. So I think taken together, you can see that the Universal Declaration would have spawned a corpus of a very rich body of law, international law, that are legally binding upon states having signed on to them. So, for example, in some, when a state or country, as a state, a nation state, signs on to an international human rights law treaty, they become they're legally bound to respect, to protect, and to fulfill the human rights of its citizens, of its nationals, yes? Respect meaning that you cannot interfere or curtail someone's human rights. Protect meaning you have to protect it. You have to act in ways where you protect the person's enjoyment of their human rights, and so you protect them from human rights abuses, yes? And finally, you have to fulfill those human rights, which simply means a state is legally bound, in theory at least, in theory, I should underline in theory, a state becomes legally bound to facilitate your enjoyment of your human rights. So, for example, if you are physically disabled and a courthouse has steps to access it, and you can't access those steps because you're using a wheelchair, there are cases where people have sought legal redress through the courts, saying that this has infringed upon my right to enjoy due process and what have you, because I can't even access the courthouse, can I? How do I get inside to enjoy legal redress and what have you, due process rather, if I can't get into the courthouse? So these are very real life cases where people have sought redress through the legal system where they could not enjoy, those rights before the court as they're entitled to. More critically, you have issues such as the right to health and the right to education under civil, under economic, social, and cultural rights, that I think in modern times people do not always see as. I think lots of people, I have had the experience of people were surprised to hear that health is a human right, but you are entitled under the international civil, that trifecta International Bill of Rights, you are entitled to a quality of health care that allows you to enjoy the fullest potential of your life, as well as education and the rights of children. And so I think these things are very important in terms of laying the framework within which international healthcare professionals operate, yes? Because it allows us to see the links between how someone's inability to have the human rights fully promoted and protected really impacts on their enjoyment of the human security. I think at this point, having mentioned human security a few times, I should probably give you a bit of a definition or framework for human security. Essentially, I think it takes off from 2012 when the UNGA, the UN General Assembly, adopted a resolution which outlined human security as an approach to help countries identify and to address the widespread challenges to the survival, livelihood, and dignity of their people. Most importantly, I think it focuses on a people-centered, context-specific approach and a prevention-oriented approach to responses that strengthen the protection of all persons and their human rights. So I think at the very beginning, it focuses a lot on a people-centered approach to security. Now, this, I would say, is not at odds with, but the traditional definition of security tends to, I think, focus on threats to people, communities, and states in terms of crime, war, and terrorism, but of course, the other threats to one's security in terms of health, or in terms of, if you're a woman, for example, the question of gender equity or being aggressive in public spaces and public transport or what have you. So, in some countries. or even in terms of gender-based violence. Those are threats, obviously, to one's human security, to one's physical security in that sense. So I think one of the things with human security we need to remember is that its point of departure is focused on the fact that the traditional concept of security goes beyond threats to people's communities and states that may be occasioned by crime, war, terrorism, but also threats to security triggered by poverty, famine, disease, gender inequity, race, or other forms of inequity. And these can, of course, create a less secure state, whether it's in economics, socially, culturally, or defensively. Laurie, Gameela, how am I going for time? I think if you give me room to run and talk, I will talk all day, trust me.
You're doing great.
Okay,
let's
great.
see. You have probably about 1 or 2 minutes, maybe, to wrap it up.
I think, yeah, there we go.
Okay.
So in sum, there are about 7 basic dimensions to human security. Economic, in terms of food, health, environmental, your personal security, your community, and political. I think as a framework in which healthcare practitioners can understand better the nature of threat and insecurity and their origins, human security is very compelling because it focuses on analyzing threat with a view towards nullifying threat. Moreover, it goes beyond identifying and it seeks to eliminate, and in its broadest aspirational form, I think it might want to eliminate the conditions that gave rise to threat in the first place, which I think is very, very critical. Because, for example, it's one thing to identify what the problem may be, but it's quite another to focus on ensuring the problem does not recur, yes? So, that resolution I referred to above that was passed in 2012 at the UNGA was very explicit in that it stated human security recognizes the linkages between peace, development, and human rights, and equally considers civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights and what have you. So I think for persons who deal with traumatized communities, understanding the origins of trauma and how we move forward dealing with these issues, it's very important to understand those particular frameworks and the cross-cutting elements that give rise to insecurity in the first place. So I think I've used up my remaining 1 or 2 minutes. Saliha, over to you, my dear. Thank you.
Thank you, Simone. Can you hear me?
Very clearly, yes.
Thank you. I think you did a fantastic setup for us as therapists when we think about psychosocial and mental health response to trauma, the wider context, and how at the state level, what is sovereignty and how does that affect what the state does or doesn't affect how we respond, from a human rights perspective. So thank you for that setup, because I think often in the mental health world, we talk about context, but and Laurie, I'm going to say, please give me a 2-minute marker.
Sure, no problem.
Yeah. So Laurie and I often talk about that. This context doesn't get included as part of our training, at least in the US, when we think about mental health, and yet a lot of us work in global context. And even in this call, as we were joining today, we were talking about where we are born and raised and where we are located. And there's so many of us who are transnationals here. So this context is global, not just because we're calling from all over the world, but it's global because of also how we live our lives, right? And so human rights needs to know no borders, is what I would say. And yet the states create those borders. And that tension within that is what we are locating some of our work. So I'm just going to share my screen to keep me on a focus here and see if I am doing it. Let me just give me a second here. Okay. I don't know if you're going to be able to see the slide version, because I do have the slide version. Do you see the slide version? Are you seeing the presentation version?
We can see the presentation.
Okay, then it's
Nice,
going to work.
nice.
Hopefully. So I want to say that there are many ways to understand and parse how we think about global family systems and psychosocial resiliency. And I want to thank Gameela and Laurie for inviting me, and the Citizen Diplomacy Action Fund for making this feasible. And I was toying with which way to talk about it. And I decided to go with where I locate my current interest in research, which is on relational resources for well-being, and specifically talk about play and reimagination. And I'm going to try the hard job of connecting to what, Simone, you were talking about. Because when you think about play and imagination, people go, well, what does that have to do with human rights? And so that's my goal. And I'm going to throw out some very big frames by which to take on this big issue of the pandemic and think and reimagine, how do we respond? What does family systems mean in this context? What does psychosocial resiliency look like? How do we pull on all that we know and also continue to build out? So that's the tall claim I'm going to go for by locating it all in creativity. So bear with me if I jump around a little bit. I want to come back to you, Simone, and build on what you were saying in terms of what we are seeing in the US in terms of COVID. So when we look at COVID right now, in terms of the number of cases, this map shows some of the epicenter, the big circles. So right now we know it's in Texas, California, it's moving inward in the US. New York, New Jersey area was, the Northeast was epicenter for some time. The cases still continue to be high, but in comparison, the epicenter is shifting. But one thing that we don't see is the very thing that I think you were speaking to, which shows up as when we go down to race and look at who's affected more, who are dying more. Nationwide, we're finding that Black people affected 2.5 times the rate of white people. So there is your racial inequality slicing, and mediating in terms of who gets affected and how, right? By the way, this is from The Atlantic, this data. They're running a whole series and collecting data, and it's called the covidtracking.com. So if people want to go in and learn more, they can. So the numbers being the numbers, the question comes in, how come, if we know the virus doesn't discriminate, how come we're seeing these kinds of inequalities in depth? And one of the things that underpins, and I think you were speaking from the human rights perspective on the Simone, and the other side of it from a health perspective, what we know is that people with pre-existing health conditions, depending on people's occupations, depending on people's living conditions, access to healthcare, which you said is a human right, which isn't in the case in the US, these mediate how we respond, both at the individual level as our personal health, but also as a social level, what our responses are. And in a study that was done in New York City, Cordes and Castro finds that clusters with less testing and low proportion of positive tests had higher income, education, and white population, whereas clusters with high testing rates and high proportion of positive tests were disproportionately Black and without health insurance. So it speaks to how human rights, the protection of our rights, can create a discriminatory response system or not. And though the virus doesn't discriminate, our response discriminates, and we see it in the way that the US government is responding. It's definitely not doing what WHO has been calling out, which is a very coordinated response countrywide and across state borders, as you were talking about it. There's a lack of coordination. Like in Texas, the Texas governor overruled the mayors from mandating masks, for example. So these kinds of lack of coordination at the state level, I'm not talking about country level, but at US state level, and then nationally, affects, because the virus knows no borders, right? It doesn't stop at a state line. And then we also see the resource allocation to states based on the political party of the governor, right? So there were, and what one can say is this is an authoritarian response that is playing out in a democracy. And by the way, to build on what Simone was saying, US is not a signatory of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that's the link I just posted when she was talking. US hasn't ratified the treaty. So even though, as Simone was saying, we're legally bound, at least conceptually, in principle, to facilitate human rights, we don't have the international agreement by which, if that's even the right word, I'm now stepping into your ground, Simone, here, by which US is held accountable for certain things by the international community. So this is the context within which we as family therapists are operating. And I'm a family therapist working with communities, clients of my own, as well as organizations. And my observation, I'm jumping from this large context to a more like a micro context, one may say. And my leap is going to be on how to connect these two. So what I see in everyday lives is there's a lot of anxiety in terms of loss, in terms of grief, worry, uncertainty of what's going to happen. My own school is going for a hybrid. I teach at Mercy College. They're going for hybrid classes. And literally last week, as I'm preparing one of my classes, we decided we are just going to go all online. So that constant movement, which is part of any crisis response, is to be adaptive, is to be flexible, but it also is continuing to create that uncertainty of how do we go on. That said, there is a lot of creativity, and that's where my focus comes in as a researcher of emergence, as a researcher of uncertainty, is I become curious, how do we relate with each other in the midst of these heavy emotions? How do we co-create? How do we stay creative? And why is that necessary? Why is creativity an important element? Well, one of the things that we know about COVID is that everything we know as we know it is collapsing. The school system has collapsed in the sense of they're doing their best, but schooling has come into our home life. The work environment is not separate from our home environment. For those who work from home, it's not that unfamiliar, but a lot of that is coming into our home. But that's not true for all occupations. People who are delivering at our doorstep, they've always continued to deliver, and they're still delivering. And that's the risk factor I was talking earlier. Their occupations makes them more at risk than my occupation, where I can sit in front of a computer and be here with you in a safe space. So what's the role of creativity here? And that's what I want to step into a little bit by first asking what matters. Because that's a question that's been coming up. What matters? And we know during adversities, people are likely to bring forth their uniqueness. We see it in the way they cope, in the way we do grief, in the way we do, how we relate to uncertainty, how we might even do creativity. I like to think about these not as differences, but uniqueness, because that becomes the Play-Doh, if you want, by which we can combine our resources and energies. So one of the things that I see is the ways in which we look at the world. What's our worldview? What's our values? What are our ways of knowing? These things impact how we cope, how we move on, how do we interact with each other at the family level, leave alone the community level. So as a lot of us as family therapists are familiar, what we notice is impacted by our positionality, by where we are socially located. This is a big concept. I'm jumping ahead, but we can come back and talk about it in a bit. So context matters. And when we say context matters, Simone spoke huge the huge, big context of state and human rights. That's a huge context. There are so many other contexts as well. So let's connect that big institutional state level to what I'm talking about at the family level. And here's a frame. It's a visual by which to hold the context as a dynamic, organic, breathing, not just an entity, but pulsating organism. As a family therapist, I might be noticing their utterances, I may be noticing the family's interactions, but often that is shaped by and is shaping the stories, their expectations. Like, so one of the common social expectation that continues is schooling has to continue. It comes from how we have structured our society. It comes from our institutions. I was on another webinar, UNESCO webinar, and somebody from Germany said, I was like, I never thought about it. Such a useful frame. Why couldn't we pause schooling for 3 months? Why did we have to really pivot? And that's what I'm talking about as imagination. How do we ask these questions rather than keeping the same structures in place? But in asking that question, we start questioning our systems, our structures, our society, the way we have structured it. And that doesn't exist without the expectations we fulfill over time. And it continues in the everyday interactions of what resources are allocated at family level, at community level. So you see this interplay between this macro, which is institution, society, and structure, and the micro in terms of our everyday interactions. Now, when I am parenting or I'm being with my client, I may not see the interplay here, but it's always there. We are constantly being created with it, by it, and creating it. So that's what I want to offer as one frame. It's a huge frame, but it's helpful to kind of visualize it. Why is that important? Because it comes back to this question of how do we pivot towards COVID? And here is my frame. Jerry is here, who also writes a lot about mindfulness and improvisation, among other things. And as we all know, we are requiring to adapt. Adaptation is the response call of this time. And in some ways, we have been here before, like people like Laurie who have worked with Ebola and folks who in the public health sector. But in most of us have not been in this kind of a global pandemic. So we really need to improvise. We can learn from what's come before, but we also need to improvise by starting to unpack how a collective trauma calls for a collective response. Jack Saul has a book on that, collective, I think it's called Collective Trauma, Collective Healing. So if those who are interested in that, check it out. There are lots of case studies and how that happens. But it speaks to, I think, what you were speaking to, Simone. We were talking about people-centered approaches and preventive approaches to human rights. And this collective response is about contextualizing, being local, and being participative, among other things. And what we do well as family therapists is focusing on the relational. And when we improvise, what does that mean at the family community level? And I'm going to go at it from a dialogic, collaborative level and specifically jump into another frame called relational play. And then I'll be wrapping up in a few minutes here, Laurie. How am I doing on time?
About 2 or 3 more minutes.
Okay, sounds good. So I've been talking about play. What is relational play? What is play? In the way I talk about play, play is the relationally creative process of trial and error by which we co-create. Often when we think of play, we think about throwing balls or playing with a balloon or sports or recreation or getting away. But play as in communing, play as in coming together to share, to be in each other's life is what we have lost with COVID. We are doing it through this medium as best as we can. But this interactive back and forth of, hey, how do you do this? My kid is refusing to do his homework. What do you do when they're not wanting to do their homework? That back and forth by which we talk, we create solutions. And that is still in place. We haven't lost that. So there are 3 forms of relational play that I want us to think about. I want to leave us with this offer. It's the play of imagination. we see the play of imagination constantly everywhere in the way people are improvising, in the way the communities are improvising. So one of the beautiful things that's happening in New York City is, as the streets are being closed down so the pedestrians can go, citizens can go for a walk, the restaurants are also flowing into the streets. So that there's social distancing and people can still go and gather, but they can also be more space and they're not inside, but they're outside. And literally, cyclists are traveling through the restaurant because the restaurant is on the street. It's an imaginative play of how do we come together and maintain social distancing. Another aspect of imagination is dialogue. Dialogue is one of the most oldest improvisational art forms that we know. As we start talking with each other, we find our way through it. We don't know where we are going, but we make it up as we go along. And so dialogic imagination, this is for those of you interested in philosophy, pulling on Bakhtin, is this interplay of textuality, pluralization of meaning, and the interrelatedness. And this is happening at the community level and at the family level. There's plural meanings. There are ways by which people are juxtapositioning different ideas. It comes down to how do you cope? How do you do grief? How do you do uncertainty? And different people have different ways. And being curious, being interested in that is part of the activity of liberation. So what is liberation? One of the ways we are looking at liberation is the way we are looking at the racial injustice, the fight against racial injustice in the US. Because as a human rights, we haven't been able to materialize it in the way that Simone was talking from a much more legal perspective. And maybe we have, but not from a social change perspective. You see the social movement occurring. It's a groundswell. Everybody's talking about it, how it's never been this way. This is liberation at play. This is how people come together to right the wrong, to fight the disproportionality in the death of Black lives. It's not just of the present moment, it's of the past, but the future can be different. So we see this play of liberation where there's a growing anti-racist movement, not just nationally in the US, but internationally, globally. And what this makes us do is globally ask, how is COVID not discriminating, but our response is discriminating? What are our local groups where resources are not being evenly accessed? When we raise these questions, there is a tension, and that's the dialectics, that's the play of dialectics. It's the interplay between the contingency and the creative. Carl Whitaker in family therapy theory talks about the dialectics of the social and the personal, the family and the individual. And there's always a tension at these points. So as we imagine and we try to create change, what is going to come and push back. So part of what we need, whether it's at the family level or the community level, and I can get into examples later, is this notion of noticing what is pushing back as it wants to be and what is trying to come alive, the emergence. How do we hold here, give the space to emergence? And that's that creative imagination. So in closing, I will say relational practices orient us to it, to listen to the emergence by connecting with each other, by learning with each other, by asking each other what matters to them, by noticing how we play out our fears and how might we dance with them in a different way. By noticing the activity of organizing as coping. There's a lot more to coping than what we might individualize or do as therapists. The activity of coming together and experimenting, the social movement as a coping is a huge example. And last but not least, I'm saying reimagination. Right now, the whole world is resetting, and we have to ask ourselves, how can we reimagine families? How can we reimagine our theories? How can we reimagine our practices? How can we be in conversation with what matters? What and how do we relate to these matters? So I'll leave you with this quote from Martin Luther King. I love it because the human salvation lies in the hands of the creatively maladjusted.
Thank you, Saliha.
Thank you. Stop sharing.
I hate to, it's such a so to interrupt you both is a challenge, because I love what you did, both of you. And one thing I want to say just at that last bit about how we have to reimagine family therapy. I mean, I certainly hope, it's one of my goals of this project, is that's what we're doing. And we're not calling this project family therapy, actually, very, very deliberately. We're talking about family systems, and the nature of the conversation must go beyond traditional ideas of what we think about when we think about therapy. So we need to be more about resilience and about health and human security. So I'm so pleased that you ended on that note, and it's beautiful to see a PowerPoint. I think we might have to rethink our idea to not have folks do PowerPoints, because we're so glad we have the PowerPoint. Well, yeah, we thought it would be, well, but look what happened. I mean, it was beautiful. It was a beautiful compliment. So I want to thank you both for what you shared. And Gameela, I don't know if you want to add anything before we take questions.
I just wanted to thank both the speakers, and I thought, Saliha, you did an amazing job linking your presentation to Simone's, and I think that was extremely useful, because I think sometimes as family therapists, I'm not one, but from here, therapists, they tend to, look at things in their little bubble, sort of, and I think it's so important to look at issues more globally, and looking at contexts in which all these situations happen. And I think it was absolutely fascinating. I want to thank both, because I think not for Simone's presentation, Saliha's presentation wouldn't have been there. So it was really fantastic, I thought. Thank you.
Yeah, very complimentary.
Yeah.
So we have
we did talk.
Yeah,
We
well,
did.
yeah, wonderful.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Before we stop the recording, anything that we want to speak about, Gameela, or ladies, that from the participants before we stop recording and then have our post-recording chat? Wow, some cool stuff. So I'll pick a couple, Gameela, maybe you can pick a couple. It doesn't look like there's any specific questions, but lovely comments. Beautiful presentation, captured the key pertinent issues, linked well together. I really appreciate Jerry bringing in Gregory Bateson, and these ideas around what has helped develop family therapy did not start out in a thing called family therapy. They started out much more broadly, and I feel that sometimes we forget that. We become very focused on the professional aspects of regulating what we do every day. That's right. It's not unimportant, it's important, but we can't forget, these very essential things that are ideas that are embedded in larger systems, including the international system. So this other comment about improvisation, yes, and deep listening, and that happens internationally. That's a value internationally, I should say, as well as in local communities. We've talked a lot about this, Saliha.
Yeah, so, I want to say one thing that Simone and I talked that we didn't touch upon is this notion of security, human security. We as family therapists and mental health folks often think about safety, but don't think about it as security. And in this moment, when we think about safety, we are thinking about emotional security. But what Simone brings forth is how much our emotional safety is tied to our contextual human rights, right? And that creates its own sense of security and safety. So if we don't address our work, the emotional work, the relational work, the family work, and the community work within the larger context that Simone offers, we have a very narrow definition of safety. And that's not good enough.
We do, and of security. And it's kind of ironic, because the whole notion that human security is relevant is because it's away from this militaristic view about what makes people, what like development as freedom, what helps people have freedom and liberty. And I think family therapy is all about that. So it's really like connecting. How do we connect the dots here with the international system and what we're talking about here? I think I'm going to stop the recording unless there's anything else you feel like we should add, Gameela, from the comments on the side. Our cool sidebar here.
Kind of reading them quickly, but I think we've covered most of. Aren't any questions in particular?
Yeah. So for the recording, deep thanks to everyone. Don't leave because the best part's about to come. I'll have to edit that out. Thank you, everyone. And I'll stop recording now. Stop recording.